Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, What Happens When Job Loss Strikes in Low-Income Families. This is our second Emerging Scholar webinar. And just a brief overview to give you some background on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. It's a virtual library. It now has over 2,100 items in it, growing continuously. It is designed for researchers, for practitioners, and for policymakers. It includes a number of interactive features, including updates on events and conferences, a portal on making a linkage, a talk about it option, and My SSRC, a personalized portion of the website. The website has a broad focus. You can see the 12 topic areas that are there. And of course, there are many ways to approach these topics. The Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse is focused on resources as they are relevant to self-sufficiency. For example, you could do all kinds of research on a topic such as childcare. The Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse focuses on childcare as an issue that's relevant to self-sufficiency. Today's webinar focuses on the emerging scholar, who is selected according to criteria that they are in graduate school or they hold a graduate degree, but are early in their career, usually 1 to 5 years out, no more than 10 years out. Someone who is currently doing research on self-sufficiency issues related to the 12 topic areas that you just saw. And someone who's conducting high-quality research that fills a knowledge gap or addresses an issue that warrants greater visibility. Today, paper fits for the PhD from the University of Chicago, Social Services Administration. His research interests, as exemplified by his talk today, are in the effectiveness of U.S. safety net programs, and you'll see barriers to unemployment insurance and low-wage work. And at the end, you will have an opportunity, or well, throughout the talk, you'll have an opportunity to submit questions through the question and answer feature on the bottom right side of your screen. And we will collect these questions, and after Dr. Schaefer has done his presentation, we will be asking him. If we run out of time, the questions will be answered subsequently and posted on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. And now I will turn over to Dr. Schaefer.
It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today, and I will take the time to participate. I want to particularly thank the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse for the opportunity to present as part of this Emerging Scholars webinar series. We Emerging Scholars always appreciate the opportunity to talk with people about our work, and I'm particularly grateful to have been invited. When we think about the effectiveness of our means-tested and social insurance programs in helping low-income families with children build towards self-sufficiency, in my mind, I think perhaps the defining question of our time is, simply put, what happens when job loss strikes? Or more specifically, I'm going to be asking, what is the response of our public programs to job loss experienced by low-income families with children? And does this response help these families continue on a path that builds to self-sufficiency? Or does it create barriers along this path? In order to offer some thoughts on these questions, I'm going to start by reviewing the transformation of the means-tested safety net over the past 20 years, which I really believe has been a watershed change in the way we deliver public support, which is of historic importance. I'm going to try to situate these changes in the lives of a low-income family who has experienced job loss, and we're going to see how our new system plays out in these circumstances. I want to talk about a few key programs and what their role is in this picture, specifically Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, or TANF, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, and Unemployment Insurance, UI. I'm going to offer some evidence that I think indicates that the transformation of the means-tested safety net that we've undertaken in the last 20 years may not yet quite be complete, because we have new problems at the very bottom of the income distribution. I'm going to offer some proposal for changes preliminary sketches of changes that might build on the current system in ways that go even further to help low-income working families remain on a path towards self-sufficiency. I'm going to be talking about various research that I've done that's been generously funded by the United States Department of Agriculture, ERS FANREP, the National Science Foundation, and the Upjohn Institute for Employment Research. But I want to stress that the views expressed here are mine alone and do not reflect these entities or the SSRC. I'm going to use one of two data sets for all the analyses. You see the current population survey. Both of these data sets are administered by the U.S. Census Bureau and are nationally representative. The CPS is our primary source for labor market and poverty estimates. Every month when you see the unemployment rate come out, that comes from the CPS. And every year when you see the poverty rate come out, that comes from the CPS. The SIP is a longitudinal survey that follows the same households over a 2 to 4 year period, and we have continuous SIP panels going back to about the 1980s. And the SIP is useful because you can use it to track the same households over time, which, as you might imagine, is part of what I do. And also, it's relatively good at capturing income among the poor, as well as capturing public program participation. We are probably all familiar with the 1996 welfare reform, which ended a cash entitlement program, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC, and replaced it with a cash assistance program, which is meant to be temporary and to require work, temporary assistance for needy families, TANF. And this was undoubtedly a major change in the way that public assistance is delivered. However, it should be viewed in the context of a number of other major changes that also took place, mostly in the 1990s, but some in the 2000s. The Earned Income Tax Credit, for example, was expanded significantly. The EITC targets working families with children, providing a refundable tax credit, which families get the full amount of, even if it's greater than what they paid in income taxes. So in this way, it provides a pretty sizable wage subsidy. In fact, the EITC has a pretty novel structure in that the value of the credit increases with wages up to a point and then plateaus and slowly decreases, reaching up to about 200% of poverty. So in 1990, the maximum credit for a family for their EITC was $953, but by 1996, the maximum credit had risen to $3,556 for a family with 2 or more children. So that's quite a substantial increase in the way that we subsidize low-wage work. We also liberalized SNAP eligibility, making it easier for families, particularly those near the eligibility cutoff, to get on SNAP and stay on it over time. We greatly expanded public health insurance for children and families through Medicaid and the State Children's Health Insurance Program, which was established in the late 1990s. So that we've really seen a major shift in the insurance composition of children. More than 1/3 of all children are now insured through public sources. And finally, we increased availability to child care subsidies for families when they are working. So what happened as a result of all of these changes? As a result, partly because of the booming economy of the late 1990s, but also because of these changes, poor families responded in ways that I think surprised most observers across the spectrum. So here you see a time series of low-educated single mothers of working age between the years 1988 and 2010. And the top trend line is the proportion of those mothers who report working during the calendar year. And the bottom trend line is the proportion that reports receiving cash assistance. So you see that single mothers dramatically increased their workforce participation. About 60% of single mothers reported that they had worked over the course of the year in 1993. By the end of the 1990s, that had risen to 80%, a 33% increase. It stays elevated during the 2000s and is still above the 1993 mark in 2010, a year with historically high unemployment rates. So single mothers went to work in response. At the same time, cash assistance roles plummeted from over 40% of all single mothers reporting that they had received cash assistance in 1993 to only about 13% in 2010, again a year of very high unemployment. In fact, now only about 1.4% of the entire U.S. population is on TANF. Turns out there are more postage stamp collectors in the United States than TANF recipients, and almost twice as many members in the Kiwanis Club. So our cash assistance program is really a shell of its former self. So we have successfully created a system that subsidizes work in a way that it never has before, while restricting need-based cash assistance. And poor families responded to these changes, engaging in the labor force at rates that few expected. But where does that leave us when a family experiences a spell of unemployment? If our aid is more geared towards the working poor, what happens when that working poor family isn't working? This, I think, is an important question when you look at the risk of unemployment faced by these families. So this trend just follows unemployment rates separated out by education level for adults 25 and older, coming from the current population survey. The bottom trend line that you might notice are college-educated workers, and you see that the unemployment rate for those with a BA or more hovers between 2 and 4% for most of the time period. And even at the height of the Great Recession unemployment rates, the rate never surpasses 5%. In contrast, if we look at the rate for the lowest education group, it's actually above 6% at the end of the 1990s, the very best period of our economy's growth, and it is above 14% for much of the last few years. So we see that unemployment is really a common experience for low-educated and low-earning families. So let's think about what this case might mean in the life of a particular family. And this case is based on a sample member from a qualitative study that I'm working on with Kathy Eden. Imagine a single mother, Jen, with 6-year-old Jessie and their dog, Scamper. Jen works as a cashier and makes about $18,300 gross, and is at a job for about 5 years. And then she loses her job because her drawer is a little bit short on cash. She can't account for a discrepancy, and so she's terminated. When we look at the resources that Jen has to rely on while she's working, we see her take-home pay after FICA taxes is about $1,270. The value of her refundable tax credits that come up bunched in a year, but if we think about that in terms of a monthly rate, it's about $217 in refundable tax credits, mostly the EITC. She now probably gets $168 in SNAP, formerly food stamps. And Jessie is on public health insurance as we've raised eligibility rates for public health insurance, and she might even be able to access a child care subsidy. Now let's look after an extended period of unemployment in terms of what Jen has to rely on. She goes down to zero take-home pay. She's accruing $0 in refundable tax credits. She might actually use her refundable tax credits from while she's working as part of a rainy day fund, although we do see that even when families are working, they're usually sort of spending that money as they go along and then paying off the bills when they receive their tax credits. She is going to get an increase in SNAP to $367, and Jessie is probably likely to stay on public health insurance. But nowadays, she's very unlikely to go on TANF, and she's very unlikely to access unemployment insurance, and I'm going to return to that point in just a few minutes. And she's probably going to lose her child care subsidy. Another thing is public housing, which does provide a very meaningful support to a lot of families. But public housing is usually a very long process to get on. For example, in the city of Chicago, where Jen lives, the waiting list from the Chicago Housing Authority is 85,000 people long, and they've actually closed it, so you couldn't even get on the waiting list if you wanted. So you see, Jen can depend on about as much aid, maybe more, when she's stably working when compared to when she experiences a long spell of unemployment. And in fact, we now do more for the working poor than we ever have before. If you had to choose to be a working poor single mom with kids in 1990 or 2005 or maybe even 2012, it would be clear what you would do in terms of a government support level. But Jen's income drops dramatically when she falls into unemployment. And what income she has is now more restricted because most of it's coming from SNAP. So it's hard to think that she's in circumstances where she could keep life stable for her, Jessie, and Scamper. This slide just sort of illustrates some of this change from some work by Ben Shalom Moffat and John Carl Schultz. It just looks at the average amount of government assistance provided by income group, separating out families below 50% of the poverty line, so these are families that are less likely to include a worker, and families who are near poor, between 100 and 150% of poverty. And you can actually see we've increased this amount of aid received by families who are near poor quite substantially while reducing the amount of aid received by families below 50% of poverty. A final sort of indicator of this comes from some work I did with my colleague Marcia Ybarra, also based on the SIP. We took some questions about material hardship. Specifically, survey respondents were asked, in the last year, did you fall behind on your essential household bills? And in 1992, 45% of families below 50% of poverty responded yes. In 2005, 48% responded yes, and this is a slight statistically significant difference. And when we look at families between 100 and 150% of poverty, we actually see a decline between these years from 37.9% to 30%. And these differences are probably affected somewhat by the fact that 1992 was a worse economy than 2005. But we see here that on some level it's possible that the changes we made in the 1990s have actually increased a certain amount of stratification among the poor, so that those who are working, when they're working, are doing better, and those who are lower down on the spectrum are doing worse. So exactly what is available for a family to fall back on when they become unemployed? Single mothers who go from working to not working but looking for work, what benefits do they get in the first few months of unemployment? Well, this is an analysis I did from the SIP comparing two periods, 1990 to 1994, 2001 to 2005, looking at single mothers working age with a high school degree or less in the 4 months after they lose their job. You see the TANF declines in significance from about 30% of these mothers who are entering unemployment accessing TANF in the first 4 months that they're on it to a bit over 10%. SNAP is by far the biggest game in town, with over 50% of these mothers receiving SNAP during a spell of unemployment in both the pre- and post-welfare periods. They may have been on this program before the economic shock, or they may have entered when they experienced an economic shock. Some further analyses that I've done suggest that families are the most likely of all of these programs of SNAP to get on the program when they enter into a spell of unemployment relative to the other programs. And UI has actually somewhat declined in its significance for these families rather than becoming more important in the post-TANF work. There's only about 1/5 of these families accessing UI benefits, and probably some of that is driven by the economy, which we know that UI access is pretty cyclical. But it does look like UI is providing support to only a fraction of single mothers who enter into a spell of unemployment. So all in all, it looks like single mothers, when they enter into unemployment, have less to fall back on than they used to. Now, why isn't UI more effective for low-wage workers? If rates of employment have been going up dramatically, why haven't we seen dramatic increases in the proportion that are getting UI? So this reports on some work I did that looks at rates of receipt and eligibility for unemployment insurance among workers entering unemployment. It's sort of a similar time frame to the last slide. It examines the period 2001 to 2003. It looks at all adult workers, but the results closely mirror what they would look like if we looked at single mothers or sort of any other group. So low-wage workers are far less likely to get UI when they enter into a spell of unemployment than either middle earners or the highest earners. But it turns out this isn't much about their earnings. They have high rates of eligibility based on their earnings. More of the disparity is a result of non-monetary eligibility, and these requirements tend to reflect differences in the nature of an employment separation. so low earners are more likely to leave a position voluntarily. And on some level, this may reflect personal level differences. But also we know that low-wage workers tend to be clustered in sectors that avoid formal layoffs. So a retailer or a service sector employer might reduce all of their part-time associates' hours from 30 hours to 5 hours with a week, keeping everyone formally employed, but with fewer hours, and this might prompt the worker to search for something else. We also see a lot of unpredictable scheduling, so that when you think back to Jen and Jesse, Jen's schedule might go from a daytime shift one week to a nighttime shift, which can create quite a bit of unpredictability. Perhaps most surprising to me is the fact that low earners, even those who appear to be eligible, and I'll remind you that these are rough estimations that can be done using the SEP, but even those who appear to be eligible seem to be less likely to get UI than middle earners or higher earners. We see a dramatic difference between these groups. So maybe it's that low earners don't feel like they need it. Maybe I haven't done a good job of estimating eligibility, or it's possible that they don't understand unemployment insurance as a rule. And actually, I have some new research out with my colleague Alex Gouldworth that suggests that this may be partially part of the answer for this phenomenon. So all of this might suggest that we have more families, both those who aren't connected to the labor market, but also those who experience some sort of extended spell of unemployment, who are surviving with very little cash income. So this might be reflected not in a change in the poverty rates, right, or even a change in the well-being of families at 50% of the poverty rate, but somewhere further down. And so Kathy Eden and I wanted to do a quick test to see if there might be some truth to this. So we used this SIP to estimate the number of households with children surviving on $2 per person per day or less in any given month. So we adapted what is the World Bank's measure of global poverty. And we took a look at households with children over the time period 1996 to 2011. Our findings surprised even us. So when you look just at cash income, so the dark non-dashed line is cash income in terms of earnings, gifts from families and friends, investment income, and TANF dollars. When you look at all of those sources, the number of households with kids in this type of extreme poverty, they're reporting $2 or less per person per day in a given month, increased by about 140%, from 636,000 to over 1.5 million households as of the middle of 2011. So this is a dramatic increase in the number of households with children who are at least reporting in a household survey that they're surviving on this extremely low level of income. When we add in SNAP, when we consider $1 of SNAP to be equivalent to $1 of cash income, we see that the program is making a substantial dent in this. So you see that it increases from about 475,000 households to about 850,000 households over the time period. So this is a dramatic change. But we still see an increase in the number of households reporting $2 or less in income of about 80%, even when we include SNAP. Kathy and I have run some additional estimates to find that if you assume that people will spread their earned income tax credit over the year and you think of access to a housing subsidy as equivalent to cash, it reduces it just a little bit more than the SNAP line. But in terms of what means-tested program is having the biggest buffering effect at the very bottom, it's SNAP, no question. How does this relate to what we were talking about before? So we did one more thing, adding just one more trend line to the top of this one. And all this trend line does is take the cash income line, right? So that includes earnings and gifts from family and friends and AFDC or TANF SSI. And we subtracted the amount of AFDC TANF dollars reported by families. And we see a very big change in the role of AFDC-TANF in buffering families against $2 a day or less type of poverty. In about 1996, cash assistance was keeping over 1 million families out of extreme poverty. And by 2011, it was keeping only about 300,000. And this may be the mixed effect of less at the very bottom when people need it. It may also be partially effect of these changes to our cash assistance program driving more people to work so that they're not relying on cash assistance. But it does suggest that our changes in our cash assistance program are an important element as to why we have this rising trend line over time. So to Kathy and I, it looks like we may have some unfinished business at the very bottom of the bottom. So in terms of my own thoughts on our means-tested and social insurance safety net, it's clear that we do more for low-income working families than ever before. Low-income families responded to these changes, the expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit, the greater availability of public health insurance for working families, and the retrenchment of cash assistance. By entering the labor force and leaving cash assistance roles in ways that surprised most analysts. But we now offer very little support for the poorest of the poor, and in fact, we should think of this as a dynamic state. We can't just separate the working poor and the non-working poor, but often they're the same people. Those who are working get a lot more aid. Those when they're not working receive a lot less. So I think in some respects, the welfare reforms of the 1990s were a tremendous success. They had all of these impacts that I think surprised a lot of us, and I think we can think of those as real successes. But in my mind, a question still remains: how can we fix the problem at the very bottom, and how can we do this in a way that doesn't go back to the way programs were? The open question to me is: can we build on increased work effort of poor families? Can we build on the programs that we've created? And I'll offer just a couple of preliminary sketches of how I think we might do this. And these won't stand up to rigorous critique, I think, at this point, but they're the framework that I hope to be pursuing as I move forward. I think a big question is figuring out a way to reform unemployment insurance to better serve low-wage workers. Very few of them are able to get it, and this is at least partly because they're clustered into jobs that tend not to meet the criteria of eligibility, particularly by non-monetary requirements. So figuring out ways that we might change those non-monetary requirements might be a path to this. It also looks like the program may not be well understood among low-wage workers, and so one possible intervention is simply to increase knowledge among low-wage workers of unemployment insurance and make sure those who are eligible have enough information to assess whether or not they should apply. Another idea that Kathy Eden and I are sketching out right now is ask would it be possible to develop some sort of, think of it as a hazard-type savings account built on top of the Earned Income Tax Credit. So if we did an expansion of the Earned Income Tax Credit, perhaps it wouldn't be additional money in the pocket of families, but it would be additional money that would be saved in an account for them that they could access during an extended period of unemployment, or maybe during another economic shock, such as unexpected marital dissolution. This obviously might be expensive and require quite a bit of new structure, but certainly the Earned Income Tax Credit has been a successful program historically. And certainly a program like this would continue to build on the EITC's connection to labor force participation. Finally, I think we need to think of some possibilities for smoothing the unpredictability of low-wage jobs. We now put a lot of pressure on our low-wage employers to be an important, even a central component of the safety nets. And so thinking of ways that we could smooth the unpredictability of low-wage jobs without hurting the business environment for these companies, but helping families is something that I think we need to think seriously about. And finally, we'll always have a segment of the poorest of the poor who can't work. And so it remains an open question to me, should we do more for them, and how could that be done without going back to the old system? So I'm going to say thank you, and I'm going to end there, and I would be delighted to take your questions and your comments. Here are the citations to the papers that I talked about today. The first one, obviously, is in press at Social Service Review. I'd be happy to send you the working paper version if you like. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Schaefer. And we encourage people who are listening to share their questions. We have a half an hour or so when we can get questions answered by our emerging scholar. One question is, how would you reform unemployment insurance? You mentioned that knowledge may be low. Do you have some ideas or thoughts about how to reach people with more knowledge, better knowledge?
Sure. So one thing that has been toyed around with and has actually been implemented in certain circumstances is that there be some sort of informational transfer when a family experiences a spell of unemployment or they leave a job, that either the employer or the state government send them the notification that they may be eligible, sort of like a pre-approved type thing. They may be eligible for unemployment insurance, and they should consider applying. Now, I have some colleagues who have been doing some work on this that suggests that figuring out this nut may be harder to crack than we might think. So I would really call for some sort of randomized trial where we could see if we send out such letters or we send out communication in another way. Maybe letters aren't the most effective way to do this. Do we actually see a visible increase in the proportion that are asking for that apply for unemployment insurance? In my work with Alex Gouldworth, what suggests to us that low-wage workers, low-educated workers don't really understand the program is that those who don't apply tend to think that they weren't eligible because they didn't earn enough, which, as you saw in one of my slides, is probably likely to be less true than they're not eligible because of the way that they left the position. So I think that's one family of interventions that we might consider, and easy enough to test. I think it would take sort of a lot of different variations to see if something like that might work. If we're seriously going to reform unemployment insurance from an eligibility standpoint, in my opinion, it has to be done in terms of non-monetary eligibility. So as I said, this is usually related to the reason why a low-wage worker left a job. As I said, low-wage workers tend to be clustered in industries that don't use formal layoffs and rely on sort of natural turnover as time goes on. So figuring out a way to change the system, because we certainly don't want to create a scenario where people know that they can just quit their job at any point and get on unemployment insurance. Proves to be a challenge. One very easy thing to consider is internationally, usually non-monetary ineligibility. So if you left your job voluntarily, or let's say technically you left voluntarily, but you left because your schedule changed or you couldn't take the unpredictability, your ineligibility would actually only last for a period of a couple weeks or a couple months. In the United States, across most states, it's for the duration of that unemployment spell. So we might reduce the moral hazard problem if we said, okay, if you're still unemployed 3 months after the job loss, then we can give you monetary eligibility. Final thing I would just say is that in the ARA, the economic stimulus, we had the UI Modernization Act, which actually provided some funds for states as long as they liberalized some of their non-monetary requirements. The primary thing they had to do was a monetary intervention. But there were some other ones that gave exceptions. So if you followed a spouse who moved, you could be eligible even if you left a job voluntarily. And so I think we're just starting to see what these types of interventions, what kind of impact they're going to have on UI. But I tend to think that they're specific enough to certain circumstances that they won't have a widespread effect.
Thank you. Another question, you made an emphasis on SNAP as a really important program. This question is, what are strategies for promoting awareness of SNAP, and might these strategies be equally effective for raising awareness of unemployment insurance?
Sure, that's a great question. As I say, and as you're right, I put emphasis on, I think SNAP is the sort of the fundamental thread of our social safety net right now, particularly for low-wage workers when they experience a spell of unemployment. We certainly have seen an unprecedented increase in SNAP enrollment over the last decade. Really, it fell during the late 1990s as the TANF caseloads fell, and that maybe was partly because of the economy. It may have also been partly because there was some confusion that people thought if they were not eligible for cash assistance anymore, they also weren't eligible for food stamps. But it starts to rise in the early 2000s. And a lot of the ways we did that was by really liberalizing eligibility so that people can actually go in, and if they seek out any service in some states, they might actually receive like a conditional eligibility that then just requires them to sort of bring in their income information. So it's kind of like moves them up in the line. And another thing that we did was increase our recertification periods, where people have to recertify over longer periods. And we know that recertification periods are times when people tend to fall off on the programs. Either they don't understand that they need to recertify, or they can't get to it for they're busy with other things. So these things really did increase the overall SNAP roll, so that now fully 1 in 7 Americans are on SNAP. It's something like 46 billion. So in thinking about more promotion of SNAP, I think as we've seen the rolls grow, and the estimates I gave actually probably get higher, up into 60%. Maybe 70% of those single moms on SNAP. I think thinking about how we could further promote SNAP is definitely a good direction. I think a lot of states are actually moving in the opposite direction as the rolls have increased so dramatically. They've brought back some of the asset tests. They've made more restrictions. So I think more likely what we'll see, I think we'll see a natural decline in the overall SNAP rolls as the economy improves. But we'll also see sort of a tightening up in some other states. And I think when we see what an important impact it's having at the very bottom, I do think that there may be some implications for that.
Thank you. And one question is, someone is wondering where we can get copies of this report, and I just want to note that there are articles on the Self-Sufficiency Research Clearinghouse. Also, this webinar will be posted, and so you can refer to it and refer your colleagues to it. Another question is about childcare, and as people who saw the first Emerging Scholar webinar may know, that the topic was on childcare. And there is a question of childcare availability for people who lose their job, and whether or not they can look for work. And could you speak to the importance of childcare as an income source and a way to get a job?
Sure. So I can't speak to that terribly authoritatively. I haven't done a lot of work with child care subsidies. My understanding is that they were greatly increased during the late 1990s, but it still serves a relatively small portion of the population that might be eligible for it. I think it tends to be connected to temporary assistance for needy families. I believe that the subsidies are mainly available when you're working. So I don't think on a widespread scale that they tend to be accessed during spells of unemployment while somebody looks for work. I also know that there are, there's lots of interesting issues that my colleague Catherine Magnuson, the first emerging scholar, and others can answer far better than I can about the level of the subsidies and how that drives decisions about what kind of care to get. What I can speak to is child care as it relates to low-wage employment. What we actually find over the course of the last 30 or so years, sort of the occurrence of off-hour work, right? So the occurrence of like night shifts and evening shifts actually hasn't increased. But what has happened, and that surprised me actually, but my understanding is what has happened is that there's been an increase in the number of people working around the standard daytime hours. So there are more people who go into work at 5 and leave at 2, or go into work at 4 and leave at 10 or midnight. So you see more sort of around that. And we also see that there's been just a lot more clustering of variability in scheduling down at the very bottom, particularly around low-wage workers. So it actually looks like, along with the stratification of income in society, that there's sort of been a stratification in work hours, as well as professional workers have tended to sort away from evening hours. And so in terms of childcare, this presents a conundrum where it's not just that a single mom, take Jennifer, she may need a childcare arrangement for Jessie, and she may be able to access one of those childcare subsidies, which she can use at a center, but she often needs to, as my colleague Julie Henley at University of Chicago calls it, package together that childcare from at least week to week and maybe day to day, so that every day she might be using multiple sources. So it's not just going to a daycare center if she can get into a daycare center, or even it's not just having my grandmother watch my child, but it might be my grandmother and my boyfriend and an aunt. And obviously, when relying on a number of moving pieces, that just introduces sort of another source of instability, which I think can be challenging.
We have another question. After a person loses welfare, how long do they keep their health care?
How long do they keep their public health insurance?
Mm-hmm.
So from a technical standpoint, my understanding would be that there's actually no connection between public health insurance and TANF receipts, so that somebody might lose their TANF. And you can lose your TANF for a variety of reasons, right? So the family might be sanctioned, or maybe their income goes up over the eligibility limit. I mean, what we've done with public health insurance is really quite a staggering thing, so that in most, I think all states, children in households making up to 200% of poverty, and I think even more commonly 250% of poverty, right? So this really goes up the income spectrum, are eligible for public health insurance. So, as Jen's income goes up, Jessie actually gets to keep that public health insurance, which, has some really interesting effects, of course. One, there's the question of, if that public health insurance wasn't available, would Jessie actually be on private insurance? So, is there a crowd-out problem? But also we know that in general, people are actually pretty happy with their public health insurance. It tends to be more comprehensive. There's often a problem with being able to access providers, but it's cheaper and more comprehensive, and so in that way it's a good thing. Now, one of the interesting things about the way that this expansion was done, we have the Medicaid program, and then we built this CHIP program on top of it. And states had the option to either just expand their Medicaid up the income distribution or to create a new program. And it's sort of an interesting case about seeing who did what. But you might imagine that if somebody loses their TANF, they might actually lose their Medicaid. Maybe their income goes up over the threshold. They might be eligible for S-CHIP, but they might actually not know about that. Again, there's this problem of not knowing whether or not you're eligible, or it might take a while to get on to the program. So, and this, I think, is, in general, we have such a mixed system where we have public options and we have private options, and even within those public options for children in a state, there might often be two different options. And so my colleague Heather Hill and I actually take a look at health insurance among children over the course of the period 1990. Again, we used to about 2005 using the SIP, and what we find is really rather interesting. So the overall proportion of children who are uninsured at any given point goes down, but the overall proportion that are uninsured over the course of a year or who become uninsured in any given month actually goes up. And you actually see sort of more of all of the transitions, right? So what we spend an awful lot of time is talking about children who move from private insurance to public insurance. We actually also see a whole lot of children who move from public insurance to private insurance, people who move from uninsured to private, who move from uninsured to public. We just see a whole lot more churning over time. And this is, just presents sort of an interesting question of what is it that matters? Is it health insurance stably over the course of a year, 2 years, with no breaks, or is it access to health insurance at a particular point of time? We're down to about 9% of our children who are uninsured now, and actually well over a majority of those, when you look at them in the SIP, should be eligible for public health insurance. So, there's an interesting question about what would happen with that child if they broke their arm or got really sick. If they go to a hospital and they are in fact eligible for public health insurance, would they, the hospital, you would think, would actually probably work to get them enrolled. But if they don't know that they're eligible for the program, they may change their sort of health-seeking behavior. So I think that goes far beyond the question, but I do think it's interesting to everyone because as has gone children over the last 20 years, I think so goes more of the country as we move into the ACA era.
Yes, well, healthcare is certainly an important topic. I want to remind listeners that you can ask a question in the lower right-hand corner of the screen, and also at the end of the webinar, there's an opportunity to provide some input. Another question is, you mentioned that only 4% of the population receives TANF. Do you think this is too low?
It's actually 1.4% of the U.S. population. So it's less than 2%. So is it too low? I think I don't think that that's quite the right. It's not exactly how I'm thinking about it. I think that indeed I will say that I was surprised, and I think a lot of us were surprised that TANF did not increase, to the level that you might expect during the greatest economic crisis of modern times. So when workers with less than a high school degree, over the course of a couple of years are experiencing 14% unemployment, we see just a lot of unemployment. I was surprised that TANF didn't increase. We did see some increases in the rolls, that's true, but it just wasn't much of a bump. And in fact, of that 1.4% of the entire U.S. population that's on TANF, actually a huge portion of that is clustered, particularly in California and New York and a couple of other states. So if you look at a lot of the other states, it's actually well less than that. So I am not necessarily saying that I think that's too low, but I do think that sort of the lack of a basic income support at the very bottom may be causing some problems for households. So, I think in the case of somebody like Jen and Jesse, who are getting quite a bit of support, who may, be using that support while they're stably employed, to lose the sort of, the wage subsidy and the EITC when they experience a spell, a long spell of unemployment. To have access to SNAP is obviously an important effect, but to not have access to any sort of cash support, I think probably, in my opinion, and I think there's more work to be done that I'm going to try to do, is not a very effective policy for promoting self-sufficiency, because I think it's less likely that Jen is going to be able to stay in her house and sort of bide her time until she's able to find a new job. And it really isn't these days that she can just get a new job whenever she wants. So in my opinion, I don't want to go back to the way that I don't want to go back to the old system. I think the old system had a lot of problems. I think the new system was successful in a lot of ways that really surprised a lot of us, and I think those successes should be noted. But I do think we need to provide some sort of cash assistance, particularly for families who are working when they experience an extended spell of unemployment, whether that looks like these hazard accounts that we're sort of trying to flesh out that they might be able to draw on, whether it looks like doing better with unemployment insurance, whether it looks like even more SNAP. I will say that I think SNAP is extremely important, obviously, but I do think there are limits to something that's restricted to the use of food. So I do think that we need to do more. We need to find some new solution at the very bottom. Again, that's just my opinion as a policy scholar and doesn't reflect any other entity except for Kathy Eden.
Okay. I have a question here about people who are unable to work. Do you have some thoughts about policy or programmatic approaches for them?
Sure. I think that's a great question. So I think, that's not where my research has been focused. So again, I don't think I can speak incredibly insightfully there. I think the lack of any sort of temporary cash assistance program has actually increased applications and the overall sort of levels of support with supplemental security income, SSI, and applications for SSDI, so that those systems are pretty overloaded. And I think those systems provide quite a bit of support for households that are able to get them. They also do, I think, create these negative incentives where it's hard to for somebody to get off or to try to, you might imagine somebody who really can't work for a period of time. Maybe they're struggling with some mental health issues, and we might like to, over the long term, sort of ease them back into the employment. And I think the system's not terribly well set up to do that. So, if we were going to sort of do more for households that can work, trying to figure out some system that might have a couple of different levels of support for households that can't work. I think obviously it's a very tricky sort of thing to try to figure out who those are. Another thing that I think we might need to consider if we're really going to depend on our low-wage labor market is some sort of larger system of subsidized jobs. I think lots of people may not be able to work in the private sector, but could do so in a setting that isn't so reflective of a private market. So could we have some sort of system that provides some support to those households and gives them access to the employment? Maybe in the long term they can shift back over. Certainly there are some that will never, but some sort of system of sorting and providing support along the continuum, I guess I would say, would be ideal.
We just have 2 minutes left or so, and I'm wondering, there's a question here about research gaps. What would be your couple of top priority research topics?
So I really hope that we can sort of plumb the barriers to unemployment insurance and for low-wage workers and figure out how we might change that system to more effectively serve those individuals. I think that we need, I'm personally looking forward to delving more deeply into these extreme poverty numbers, which I find pretty dramatic. So Catherine Eden from Harvard and I are working on a qualitative sample where we're going to be following some households that would fit the definition of extreme poverty in the SIP and see exactly what their circumstances are. I actually think that as I've been doing that particular study, it's really been brought home to me the important role that family and friend networks play in providing a buffer of support. So thinking about the strain across networks, I know there's some research on social networks. I think there might be more that we could do there. And of course, I think a new line of research that I'm excited about and I think will continue to will grow is looking not just at families with children, not focusing just on single mothers, but also on disconnected men who are not in the labor force, often have had interaction with the legal system. Often many are parents. Kathy Eden and Tim Nelson have a new book out on this, but I think there's a lot more work to be done because, of course, everything that I talked about today is really limited to households that are with children. So I think very understudied is the situation of disconnected men.
Great. I want to thank you very much, Professor Luke Schaefer, for an excellent talk. And thanks so much to everyone for joining us. As you exit the webinar, there will be a questionnaire that pops up, and we encourage you to provide your thoughts there as well. Again, thank you so much. Goodbye.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.